The US Attorney General has opened an investigation into the Minneapolis Police Department after Derek Chauvin was convicted of murdering George Floyd. The probe will determine whether there are systemic policing issues. Greg Milam has more.
In all of that relief yesterday about the verdict and the fact that there weren't violent protests here or around the United States, there was a hesitancy to celebrate too much because they were worried that it was all just words coming from the president and other political figures. So this is a concrete step. This Department of Justice investigation will come in. And remember, there is no national police force in the United States, but the federal government has the right to do this, to come in and look at what they call the patterns and practice of a police department like Minneapolis, to look to see if they routinely use excessive force, if there are discriminatory practices, and they can make recommendations that will be enforced by a court. So that has been welcomed here. This is what the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, announced in announcing that investigation.
Yesterday's verdict in the state criminal trial does not address potentially systemic policing issues in Minneapolis. Today, I am announcing that the Justice Department has opened a civil investigation to determine whether the Minneapolis Police Department engages in a pattern or practice of unconstitutional or unlawful policing.
So that has been welcomed here as a concrete step, as I say, because they are dubious about politicians who have promised a lot since George Floyd died. There's a thing called the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act that's been floating around on Capitol Hill since last summer. It hasn't been passed. It would do things like banning police from using chokeholds. It would enforce racial bias training. There'd be a register of police misconduct. But it hasn't been passed, and there is pressure for things like that to happen, to show a real intent to make change. And on the ground, of course, the death of George Floyd being such a personal story for his family and those close to him, his brother yesterday saying in response to that verdict that we can breathe again now. And listen to this from Courtney Ross. She was George Floyd's girlfriend for 3 years up until his death, talking about what that verdict has meant to her and his family.
I miss Floyd so much, you know, it's hard to think about how I feel, but I do know that I'm really hopeful for change right now.
And now, one thing you hear a lot here at the moment is about how much has really changed, because the circumstances in the George Floyd case were so unusual, and that trial was so unusual. So many witnesses who were there, all of it videoed by one of the bystanders, and a real overwhelming amount of evidence that led to that guilty verdict in court yesterday. The question a lot of people ask here is, if that was happening somewhere today and it wasn't being filmed, would there be a similar verdict? Has that much really changed? And that is a big question people here and across the country still have.
I miss Floyd so much, you know, it's hard to think about how I feel, but I do know that I'm really hopeful for change right now.